Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. So I know a lot of you out there are using Airtable and you're trying to think, how can I connect my Airtable to Wix? Maybe you've tried some third-party solution like Zapier, but those tend to be also quite pricey and also not so flexible, so maybe you can't do exactly what you want to do. In that case, what we can do is we can use the Airtable API and gain full control over updating and getting records from our Airtable and much, much more, and all that just for the cost of setting up the code. So you can do stuff, for example, like add these events that I added in here using a form on my Wix website. And you can also go ahead and display events directly from your Airtable, all using the Wix backend and your Airtable API. So if you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. Okay, so before we hop in and start coding, let me first talk about my setup here. So first of all, if you don't recognize what you see behind me, then you're probably in the wrong tutorial, but this is Airtable. And I just have a random table here from a template that they offered me as soon as I kind of created the account. I'm not a frequent Airtable user. I have some like very minimal experience, but that's the beauty of APIs because you don't really need to have a deep experience with the platform in order to use it. You just need to know how to read documentation and test and experiment. So I have this table over here. It's like an event planning table. And if you're inside and you're following along now, then you'll probably want to go up here to the upper right side. And you'll see here on the bottom that you have this developer hub. And we're going to be interacting there a lot, and there's a lot of important information there for the API integration. So you'll want to click and head in there if you haven't done so already. Once you do, then you should reach a page like this, and you'll want to head over to personal access tokens, so right over here, and you're going to want to create your token. I realized that this is actually a good timing for a tutorial because when I went over here to check out this API key section, it actually says that this has been depreciated quite recently. So if you're also just transitioning from the old API to the new API, deprecated. I'll thank my dad for pointing out that I pronounced that wrong. So it has been deprecated. And yeah, so now we're moving over to these personal access tokens. So you haven't created one already, then you'll want to create it over here. I'll create that kind of privately later because I don't really feel like giving you my access token. But once you create it over here, you're going to want to head over to the secrets manager, and I'll show you where to plug that in. Except for the creation of the token, which is kind of like a password, which will allow us to access the API. We also have the developer docs over here. And over here, that will take us basically over here. And we have instructions essentially for how to interact with the API. Today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be playing around here with the records API, and we're going to be doing two things. So we're going to be doing list records, which will essentially let us get the data from a specific table, and we'll also be creating records. Okay, so essentially adding data to a table. And I think those are the two basic things that most people will probably want to do with their Airtable. Obviously, the API is much more robust than that, and we don't have the time to delve into everything. So when I hopped in to create my token, I actually realized that there's an important stage here that you'll probably want to not miss. So before they actually give you the token, if I go ahead here and click create token, we have to first of all give this token a name. So I'm just going to call it Wix. And then we have two important parts here, which is the scopes and the access, which I realize might be a little confusing if you don't really have experience working with APIs. So the scopes essentially will be what kind of actions or which API endpoints this API can interact with, or sorry, the person with this token can interact with. And we're going to be using the read, okay, so data.recordsRead, and we're going to also be using data.recordsWrite. And that should be sufficient for us in order to do those two basic interactions that I mentioned earlier with the tables. And the other thing that we're going to have here is access, which is essentially which of my workspaces and bases, I think they're called in Airtable, if I'm not mistaken, we can interact with. So I'm just going to select this event planning one, and because that's what we're using for this example. But this is a great way to keep up the security of your Airtable. For example, if you have certain users or certain people who are only supposed to be able to access certain things or execute certain actions, then you can do that by creating multiple tokens and passing only the relevant tokens in to the relevant functions, or giving the relevant tokens to relevant people, etc. So that's just here in terms of creating the token. And I'm assuming that once I go and now click create token, my token will be created. So I'm going to go ahead and create that and then show you where to put that inside of your secrets manager. So here I am in the secrets manager. And in order to arrive at the secrets manager, I went to the Wix dashboard of my website. And then I headed over here to developer tools and then secret manager over here. And now what I'm going to do is click store secret in order to create a new secret. And I'll call this Airtable token, just to use the same language that they use. And I'm going to paste the value that I copied over from the token that I just created right over here inside of the secrets manager. And then we can access this through the backend of our Wix website. So let me head over now to the editor and give you a brief overview of what I set up here. So essentially I have a backend file, airtable.web.js, and this is where we're going to be writing the functions that actually make calls to the Airtable APIs and either retrieve data or update the data there. And I've also created a new blank page on my website where we can have a front end that will interact with that data and even submit data to Airtable via a form. Okay, so now that we've done an overview of the basic setup, we're ready to hop in and start writing some code. And we're going to be starting off in the backend inside of our airtable.web.js file. And you can see here that I've already imported permissions and web method, which are necessary for building out the web methods that we can call in the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and start by creating our first web method. And I'll call this const get data from Airtable. And this will be equal to web method. And here we need to pass in two things. So one is our permissions, and I'm going to set it for now to anyone. So that means anyone will be able to call this function from the front end. And I'm also going to pass in the function, which is going to be making a call to the third-party API, which is Airtable. So this is going to be an asynchronous function because we're fetching data. And it can be a nameless function because it's built in here into the web method. So it's an unnamed function that is going to essentially call our Airtable API. So in order to do that, we're going to need to have a few imports here up top. So the first thing I'm going to import is fetch from Wix fetch. And this is going to allow us to make requests to third-party servers, and that's what we need to do here. And the next thing I'm going to do is import get secret from Wix secrets backend. And that's going to allow us to retrieve the token that we stored inside of the secrets manager in a secure way. So the first thing I'm going to do over here is I'm going to get that secret. So I'm going to say const, let's call it token, equals 2. And what we're going to have here is await because it's a promise. And I'm going to get secret. And here we're going to need the name of the secret, which was Airtable token. If you have any doubt, you can just go ahead and check the name again in the secrets manager, because if you get that name wrong, then it's not going to get your token. And another thing that we're going to need here now is the endpoint for the API. So that is something we're going to need to get from the documentation. So let me head over to the Airtable documentation. And again, we're here inside of list records. And here is an example request. And you can see here that we have the endpoint, which is right over here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that over. And I see here that we're also going to need to pass in authorization. Okay, so we'll deal with that in a moment. but let's first set up our endpoint. So I'm going to head back here to our backend, and I'll say here const endpoint equals 2, and I'm going to put this inside of a template literal, and that's because this URL is actually dynamic. You can see here that we have two parts that are determined by which base and which table you're trying to get the data from. So I'm going to add here and here a $sign, which will turn this essentially into a variable. So this is a variable that we can pass into this to this URL and make it appropriate for our specific Airtable. And we can approach this in two ways. So either we can pass those in here as parameters. So I can say here, for example, base ID and table ID. We can shorten it to just table ID. And we can pass those in as parameters, and essentially when we're getting this data from the front end, we can pass in that table ID and that base ID. I think that a more realistic situation here is that we will declare those as variables inside of our backend, because it's unlikely that you'll want to call different Airtables. I mean, you might. I don't know. I'm kind of I'm kind of making an assumption here, but I will be building it into the backend, like hard coding what this base ID and table ID is, because I'm only interacting with one table at the moment. But if you wanted to create something a little more dynamic, then this is how you would approach it. So let me go ahead and declare those variables. So I'm going to do that right over here. So we're going to have const base ID, and we're also going to have const table ID. Okay, and how do we find this base ID and table ID? So luckily we have this handy dandy article from Airtable, which explains that if you take a look at the URL of your table, then you can find the base ID over here and the table ID over here. So let's take a look at the URL of our table right over here. And you can see here, so this is going to be our base ID, and this right over here is going to be the table ID. So let me just copy those over into the editor. So this is going to be the base ID. And right up here, this is going to be the table ID. And I'm going to now switch out the variables here for this base ID and table ID. So base ID and table ID. So now we're kind of hard coding it, and we can get rid of these parameters over here. Okay, so now that we've finished setting up our endpoint, we're ready to set up the options. And to do that, I'm just going to kind of reconfer with the documentation. So if I go over here back to the Airtable documentation, so first of all, we want to see what kind of request this should be. And I can see right over here that this is a GET request. So if it's a GET request, I could either declare the method as GET or just leave the method blank, because the default for fetch is that the method is GET. In terms of the authorization, so we have this header over here. So I'm just going to copy over this header that we have. And I'm going to head back over here to the editor. And let's create our options. So const options. And here we're going to have headers. And within the headers, we're going to have the authorization. And here this is going to need to be a string. And here we're going to pass in our token. So instead of your token, I'm going to switch this to the variable of token, which again, we got right up here. Okay, so that is our token. And now we're ready to actually fetch the data. So let's do that right over here. And I'm going to say const response equals to await fetch. And we can pass in our endpoint, and we can pass in our options. And then we can say const data equals to response.json. And this is also a promise, so we're going to want to have the await keyword here as well. And last but not least, let's return the data that comes back from this function. And the last thing I'm going to want to do here, which I should have done earlier, but it's no big deal, is that this web method needs to be exported. And the reason we want to do that is A, so that we can access it from the front end, and B, to allow us to run some tests. So just a little context for my shocked face before. So I was expecting here on the left-hand side to have the option to test this function in the backend. And for those of you who are either not familiar with the channel or new to Wix, new to coding on Wix, basically we're kind of in a transition period where Wix is changing the backend files from something called .jsw to .web.js. So let me just show you here some files that I have here in the backend. You'll see that some are .jsw, some are .web.js, and this .jsw is being deprecated. So if I was to add a new file to my backend, then you could see the deprecation notice over here. But you can still use them, and these .jsw files actually allowed a super cool feature, which is that you can test backend functions in the backend without needing to import them on the front end. And I literally feel like I'm being stabbed in the back by Wix because they didn't include this like super useful thing in something that's supposed to be new. To me, new usually should mean an improvement, but it actually seems like the web modules are really bad. At least now. I mean, it could be that they're working on some changes that I don't know about, but I really hope that they don't fully deprecate the old version until the new one is at least on par. But that's really another topic. So if you're here for Airtable and just Airtable, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually create one of these .jsw files just to run the testing and to make sure that our function is working. So I'm going to kind of add that right over here, and I'll call this one Airtable as well. And as long as you see that these JSW files are available, you could technically also build everything here inside of a JSW file and import it on the front end. I think it'll probably be a very long time before it's completely unavailable inside of your Wix website, or if they completely remove them at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy over the code that we have over here. And we're going to need to make some adjustments to make it compatible with the JSW. So first of all, we don't need to import this permissions and web method. And here, instead of exporting it within a web method, I'm just going to export async function. And let's call this function get Airtable data. And let's put all of this here inside of the function. Awesome. So now that we have a function set up, you can see here, this is what I was looking for earlier. You can see this kind of blue arrow right over here. That's going to allow us to test this in the backend. So let me just go ahead and give that a click. And you can see it's going to open up this little nice test suite for us. Let me try again. There we go. And I'm just going to hit run right over here. And boom. So here we got returned with, and let's see what's in here. So here we have records, and essentially this is a list of records. So if I go in here, we can get all the fields. So we see here start, grand ballroom, etc. And here each one of these is kind of one of the columns inside of my records. So it's an array of objects that essentially matches this table over here. So I managed to get probably all my records because there's only 19 records. Let's see how many records. Yeah, I got back 19 records. And that's the kind of the basics of getting back the data. But you'll note that there are more elaborate things that we can do with this API. So if I head back over here into the documentation, then you'll see that in addition to just making a simple kind of call to the endpoint, we also have the option to pass in different parameters. So the path parameters were required, so we passed those in, but we also have all of these optional query parameters that we can pass in. So for example, page size, which defaults to 100. So that means if I had more than 100 records, it would only send me back up to 100 unless I changed the page size. If I wanted less records, I could also change that page size to less records. And then if I wanted to get the next page, I would have to make another query with some kind of instruction for getting the next page, which is, I'm sure, is here somewhere in the documentation. In addition, oh, here, that's here, offset. Okay. In addition to that, we can also sort. So kind of like if we want it to be ascending or descending, depending on a certain field, so let's say A to Z of the name field or something like that. We also have the option of getting back only specific fields. So for example, I don't need all the record data. I only need like one of the columns to come back. So I can specify which fields I actually want to come back, etc., etc. So depending on your specific use case, you'll want to look into these specific query params that you can pass in and request specifically the data that you need or in the format that you need. Okay, so we can't demonstrate all of those query parameters, but I do want to give you one or two examples just so that you know how to do it if you do want to add certain parameters of your own. So in order to add the parameters in a GET request, we have to add them as query parameters, and those are added directly to the URL or using various methods that they have in Node for adding URL parameters, etc. I'm just going to add it directly to the endpoint so you can visually see what we're doing. So I'm going to head over here to the endpoint, and I'm going to add the parameter that will define the page size. So just to remind you, if I go over here to the API documentation, we want to add in this page size, and then we're going to have a number. So to do that, I'm just going to head here, go to the end of the URL, and the first query param is always added after a question mark. So I'm going to add here page size, and then equals 10. And that's pretty much how we do it. And now if I go in and I go to test get Airtable data, and I click run, then we should get back only 10 in our response. So if we take a look here at the records, and you can see here now it's an array with 10. And if I was to change that to 12, it would be 12, etc. So that's one example. Another one is these fields. Okay, and I'm specifically choosing this one because I think that it's one of the more challenging ones because it has to be an array of strings. So first of all, let me point out what the fields are that we're passing in. So fields are essentially these columns. So for example, we could have inside of our fields array activity, we could have type, location, etc. And then it would only return that specific column. So all the records, but just that specific column. So let's try passing in, let's say, for example, activity and location. So I'm going to go here back into the editor, head back over here, and we're going to add an additional query param. And to do that, we're going to be using the and symbol. Every single query param after the first query param is added on with an and symbol. So here it's going to be fields, and then opening up kind of like an invisible array or an empty array to signify that this is an array. And we're going to say equals activity. And we're going to add in another one just like that. And we're going to say fields, again, with our kind of phantom array there, and then equals to location. And you can see I'm just using the name as is from inside the table. You could also use kind of a specific unique ID that each column has, but I think this will probably be a little more intuitive for most people. So now that I've added those in, let me head back over here to my testing suite, and I'm just going to hit run again. And let's see what we got back here. So I got back the records, and if I go here into the fields, then you can see that for each one, I got back only the location and the activity. So I didn't get back all the data, and this is significant, like if you're getting back a lot of records, or if your table is like really super big and you have a lot of columns, and you don't want to just fetch lots of data for no good reason because it could take more time, and why fetch data that we don't need? So you can really kind of narrow it down to the specific fields. And again, this is just an example of two of the possible query params that we could pass in, but there are a lot more that you can play around with. So now that we've kind of built out that interaction between our Wix backend and the API, what I want to do is now show how we can actually get that data on the front end inside of our Wix website and display that on a page of our website. So here we are on the front end of the website on a page on my Wix website. And you can see here that I've added in a repeater element. And I've taken the liberty of doing all the naming already. So I called this the events repeater. You can maybe see it behind, trust me, it's called the events repeater. And if I click on the title here, you can see I called it activity, and this is called location. And this isn't really going to be a tutorial about how to use repeaters or other methods of displaying data on the page. I'm going to show you a basic kind of connection here, but if you want to learn more, I do recommend checking out my other tutorials about how to display data in repeaters and Wix tables. Also using external data from APIs, just like we're doing now. So now that I have my repeater set up, I'm going to go ahead into the page code. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to import my function from the backend. And I'm going to just use the one that we've been using inside the JSW. And the importing works pretty much the same whether you're using web methods like .web.js or .jsw. Just make sure that you're naming the files correctly that you're doing the import from. So get Airtable data from, and this is going to be from backend slash airtable.jsw or airtable. And if we were doing from the .web method, then it would be .web here. Okay. But I'm just going to take it from the JSW. So I'm importing here from backend slash airtable. And now essentially what we want to do is we want to call that function in order to get the data and then use that data to populate the repeater. So I'm going to create over here an async function under my onReady. So let's do that right over here. And I'll say async function populate events repeater. And I'm calling it events repeater because that's kind of what was inside of my Airtable, like this table with lots of different events. And what I'm going to do here is I'm first going to set up the onReady for the repeater. So let me select my repeater. That's the events repeater dot onItemReady. And here we're going to say item and item data. And then we're going to assign the values to the specific items, to the specific elements. And I'm going to say here, so let's select activity. And that will be equal dot text will be equal to item data dot activity. Activity. And I'm doing this here in uppercase because that's how the data was structured within Airtable. And let's also set up the location. So location.text will be equal to item data.location. And then once we've instructed the repeater kind of how to behave once it receives data, we can actually go to the task of getting that data from the backend. So I'm going to say const data, or let's call it event data equals to await get Airtable data. And now we need to address how this data is actually going to come back to us, like what structure it's going to be in. And we'll have to break that down into something that we can pass into our repeater. So just to do kind of like a small refresher, if I run this in the backend, then you'll see that first we get the records. So I'm going to want to tap into those records. And then within each, then the records is an array. And each array has an ID, and then it has the fields. So if I just pass in this array of records as is, then I'll need to tap into these individual fields, which is totally fine. And one more thing that we'll have to do is that you'll notice here that the ID that we get here is not in the format that Wix expects for a repeater. So for a repeater, you need to have underscore ID. So we're going to need to map that out into something that Wix can use. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to head back here to the front end. And once we get the event data, we're going to want to pass this to the repeater. So I'm going to say events repeater dot data, and that's going to be equal to the events data dot, events plural. I'll make it plural because there's multiple events. Data dot records. Okay, because remember there's within the events data, so we have an object with the offset and the records, and we want to tap into the records. And then we're going to want to map that so that for each record, we're essentially going to return an object with the record data itself. And we're also going to add over here another field that's ID underscore ID, which is equal to the record dot ID. Okay. And there's one small adjustment that we need to make is that here within the item data, we need to tap into not only item data, but item data dot fields dot activity and item data dot fields dot location. And that has to do with how the data was structured here. So just to remind you, so we have records, and then within each record, we want to dive into fields, and then within fields, we have location and we have activity. Okay, so let me head back over here. Over here. And this is looking pretty good. So I'm just going to call this function over here inside of my onReady. So let's call that over here, populate events repeater. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to publish the site and show you what it looks like on the live site. Okay, so here I am on the live site and everything is looking great. So you can see here that I have a repeater with 10 items because we got back 10 records. And for each item on top, we have here the activity. And here on the bottom, we have our location. So this is an example of how you can kind of use Airtable as a database and still display data on your Wix website as if it was kind of in the Wix CMS or something like that. So that's one direction. And now I'm going to show you the other direction, which is how you can, for example, create a form on your Wix website that will update the records inside of Airtable so that you can kind of add a new line if you want to add a new event, for example. So in order to create new records in Airtable, we're going to be using this create records endpoint. And we can see here that we have an endpoint which is similar to the one we were using for getting the record. The only difference, or at least the main difference, is that it's a post method request instead of a get method request. And that's because we're posting new data to the table. Other things to note here is that we also need to add in the content type header, and we're also going to be passing in a body with an array essentially of records. Okay, so that's the kind of the structure of our body. So let's first build this out in the back end, do some testing, and then we can build a form on the front end, which will facilitate this update to or adding of new records to our Airtable. So let me head back here to the back end of our website, and I'm just going to continue here in the .jsw file for now, because it's just easier to run testing in the back end, and I'm going to use it as long as I have it. So let's go ahead and create a new function here, and I'm going to call it export async function, and let's call this create new record. And here we're going to want to pass in a parameter later on, but for now I'm going to leave it without parameters while we're doing testing in the backend. So essentially a lot of this is going to be similar to what we had in the previous function. So I'm actually going to copy over what we have here and paste it here as a starting point for this new function. And here we're not going to be able to pass in any query params, so I'm just going to get rid of this right over here. And we have to change a few things. So first of all, we're going to have to add inside of the options, we're going to have to add in a method, and that's going to be post. In addition, we also have to add in a content type header over here, and I'm just going to copy it from the documentation so that I don't make any typos. I'm going to go over here and copy this right over here, and this just tells essentially their server how we're sending the content, which is going to be in JSON format. So let me just go right over here. Oops. And I'm going to paste this right in there and just do some formatting here. Awesome. So that's the content type. And last but not least, we also have to add in the body over here. So let me do that. So I'm going to add in body. And this body is going to need to be a JSON. So I'm going to do JSON dot stringify. And here we're going to have an object which has records. And this is going to be an array. And if we take a look again at the documentation, so what we need to do here is we need to have fields as an object, and then we need to pass in the fields that we want. So I'm just going to start by passing in one item in this array, one record, and it will just have an activity and a location. Okay, because that's what we've been playing around with, so that's what we're familiar with. So records, and then here I'm just going to pass in one record, which is going to have a field activity. And let's just say this is a test. And we're also going to have a location. Also, this is a test. Awesome. So this should be all we need. Again, we'll test it out and see, make sure I haven't made any mistakes. So I'm going to go ahead here and click our handy dandy test button. And going to click it one more time. There we go. And let's go ahead and run this. Awesome. So let's see what we have here. An error. Lovely. Could not find the field fields in the request body. Awesome. So let me try and see where I made a mistake here. Records. And yes, so I did not add in fields. So that's going to be here. Fields. Let me just show you where I made the mistake. Fields. And then we're going to have, okay, so it needs to be, let me just double check the documentation. So we have an object with fields which has an object. Okay, so let me go over here. So here we're going to have an object, and then these fields are going to be inside of that object, like so. Oh no, I've made a complete mess. Let me backtrack here. Okay, so these fields need to go here. Awesome. Okay, so it's an array, object, fields, object. Okay, let's try that again. Go ahead and hit run. Returned with error, invalid permissions, or the request model was not found. Check that both your user and token require permission model name ID are correct. Okay. Give me a second. I'm going to do some debugging and I'll come back to you with my findings. Okay, so I think I found the problem. And if you recall, while I was setting up our access token, I referred to these scopes that we have over here. And I see here that I actually made a mistake and I set one of the scopes to something that I completely did not intend. And I probably, as I said it, I said something else, but I accidentally set this as data.recordComments.read or recordComments.read, and I wanted this to be records write. So let me fix that. So I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to add in here a new scope, and I'm going to add in here data.recordsWrite. And the reason that it wasn't working is because a post request is essentially me trying to write in a new record, but I didn't have permissions for it here in the scopes. So if you get that error that you saw before, then double check your scopes, because it might be that you don't have the right scope or the right access, and that's what's causing your problem. So I'm going to go ahead here and save these changes. And now I'm going to head back to our backend here in Wix, and I'm going to try running this backend function again. And let's see what happens. So now essentially it returned data, which is an indication to me that the operation was successful, and it returned the record that was created here. with activity and location. And if I go here into my Airtable and I scroll down here, scroll up here, so you can see here, activity, this is a test, and here in location, this is a test. So now we just need to make some small modifications here because we want people to be able to pass in essentially the data here or the new records from the front end. And I'm going to be creating a very simple application. So I'm only going to be creating one record at a time, not multiple. So essentially what I need to pass in here to the create new record is just the fields. Okay, so I'm going to pass in the fields up over here, and I'm going to change my body so that the fields that are passed in are essentially the fields from the parameters. So that means I can set those fields in the front end, and whatever fields I pass in, that's what the new record will be created with. So now we can hop over to the front end of our site again and create that form, which will allow us to submit a new record. Okay, so here I am back on my front end, and what I've done is I've created a very basic custom form. And what I have here is two inputs. One is the activity input, and the other is the location input. And I have a submit button to submit the form. So super simple, and I'm just going to be creating events with an activity and a location for the sake of time. And let's build that out here inside of the page code. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new function down here, and it's going to be an asynchronous function. And this function is going to be submit form. And what this function is going to do is it's going to first get the values of those two fields. So let's say const activity equals to activity input dot value. And we're also going to get the location, so const location equals to, and the same thing, we're going to select the element, so location input dot value. And now we're going to format it into the format that we need to pass into our backend function. So I'm going to say here const fields equals to, and this is going to be an object. And I'm going to say here that activity is equal to activity, and that location equals to location. And just really notice the whole uppercase, lowercase thing here, because it's a little confusing because typically when we're naming variables and properties and keys and stuff like that, we'll start with lowercase. But just because it takes the actual name from Airtable and those names might be uppercase, they might be lowercase. So that's why here we have these properties that look kind of a little weird to people if you're used to coding. But it's easier to work like this than to kind of use their IDs or to try and change the names in the table. So just take note of that. Okay, so we set up our fields, and now the last thing we're going to want to do here is to call the backend function. So let me first import the new backend function that we created right over here. So we're going to just double check the name. So it's called create new record. So I'm going to copy that over, and I'm just going to paste it right over here inside of our imports. Then I can go right over here and I can call the function. So let me go ahead and zoom right in for you guys. And I'll say const new record equals to, and we'll have await, create new record, and then we'll pass in the fields. And so this new record, I'm going to say that if no new record dot error, because if you recall, before when we were getting an error back, so it essentially it sent back data with an object that had a property of error. So if there's no property of error, then I'm going to assume that everything went smoothly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh our page. And that will essentially refresh the repeater that we have up there as well and display the data. There's other ways to do this. This is not the only way to do it. I'm just kind of going for the quickest way out at the moment, just for demonstration purposes. So what I'm going to do here is import Wix location, import Wix, whoops, Wix location. And then here, back here in our function, I'm going to say Wix location frontend dot to Wix location frontend dot URL. So that will essentially refresh the page. And now the last thing we need to do is assign this submit form function to the event listener for our button. So let me go ahead and do that right over here. So I'm going to select our button. So that's the submit button. And dot on click, we're going to submit form. Awesome. So this is really very, very basic, but I'm ready to start testing. So I'm going to publish this and we'll go to the live site and see if this is working. Okay, so here we are on the live site and I'm going to submit our create an event form. So I'm just going to say the activity is going to be awesome event, and the location is going to be my house, of course. And then I'm going to go ahead and click submit. And let's see if we refresh. So yeah, you see that the page refreshed. And let's see if we can find that event here now inside the list of all our events. So you can see here, awesome event, my house. And if I go back to Airtable, then you can see here as well, awesome event happening at my house. Okay, so that's how we can create a form that will essentially update an Airtable or add something to an Airtable using the API. And we're going to wrap up here for today. I hope that you found this informative. I know it's just really scratching the surface, but I hope that it can open up a whole new door of those for those of you who are using Airtable and want to see how you can kind of integrate your Airtable data with Wix without using any other third-party solutions. If you enjoyed the tutorial, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more tutorials like this in the future, I have new videos every week, so you can go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.